Now, Hetty Johnson.
Right, well, thank you very much. There's lots of P's in mine.
Go for it.
Because there's protection and there's all kinds of words that start with P. First of all, thank you very much for organising this, and thank you for your very hospitable welcome. Given that we are, I would imagine, on the majority on different sides of this fence, I appreciate the warmth that was shown me when I got here today. The other thing I'd like to say before I start is that I've never actually read a speech from a piece of paper. Usually I'm just doing it because I'm talking about what I know best. This has an element in it of art that I don't know. I'm not an art critic. I'm a child protection advocate. That's what I do. So what I've decided to do is read from this speech and then break into the real Hetty when we break into questions and whatnot later. So if you'll just forgive me, I'm not good at this, so I'm not good at looking up and all the actions. I shall start. The Henson debate is a debate, though, that we did have to have, and not just here in Australia, but internationally. And it is a debate that is much, much wider than Bill Henson. And there are two fundamental issues that need to be considered. The first is the freedom of the artistic community to express themselves and to push boundaries, creative boundaries. The second, though, is the freedom of children to be children and the violation of the rights and the protection of children. And to quote Bronwyn Bishop, when it comes to what's more important, as far as human rights are concerned, it's a no-brainer. It's an emotional debate, and there are some emotive tags, such as censorship, pornography, artistic freedom, which have to a degree hijacked this discussion in recent weeks and taken us down all kinds of side alleys. These topics and issues are important and they are relevant. However, they distract from the core issue and what is truly at stake here. Ultimately, this debate is not about pornography and it's not about censorship. It's not even about art itself. It's about respecting and considering the implications that artistic freedoms and rights may have on the wider issue of child protection. That must be our first responsibility, because if that responsibility is not taken seriously, it infringes on one of the most fundamental of all human rights in the most horrific way. Artists cannot and must not divorce themselves from this responsibility, and neither should any other category of professional. For me, this debate has highlighted the potential for abuse of unrestrained artistic freedoms and rights, and what that poses to the detriment of children, not just the children who are the subjects of the art, but moreover for the wider populace of children and the legal systems designed to protect them. I see this debate as a healthy sign of a society that is evolving in its understanding of the rights of children to be protected and free from sexual exploitation. For most of human history, intentionally or otherwise, adults have exercised their rights, their greed, their personal desires, their whims, with little or no consideration to the rights of children. The growing increase in awareness, respect and legislation for the rights of the child have been hard won by organisations globally, including Bravehearts. We have been responsible for quite a list of legislative reform in the 10 years that we have existed. Thankfully, times are slowly changing. We are all part of a cultural shift that is bringing us to a time when we understand the need to consider the ramifications of our actions or inactions, intentional or otherwise, on the safety of children. Over the past decade or so, institutions and organisations around the globe, including the churches, have been forced to face a growing acceptance, a reality and an understanding of the need to prioritise their responsibilities to the safety and well-being of children. They have been challenged to explore the wider ramifications of their actions and the historical approaches as to how they deal with the protection of children. They have learnt that any institution that fails to put systems in place that prioritise the protection of children will attract those people to it who will use it as a means to access children for their own perverted reasons, safe in the knowledge they will be protected, either by law, by process, by denial, by fear, by tolerance, or by sheer ignorance. These institutions have now learnt the need to instil clear protocols and risk management strategies. They have learnt, through successful damages claims against them, that community and judicial tolerance for failures to consider children will cost them dearly. And they have learned that their historical failure to consider and protect children as a priority has the effect of not only depleting their bank balances, but also their reputations, their standing in the community as an institution. The challenge for the arts community is to likewise embrace the protection and safety of children as a priority. It is now up to me, to you, to all of us, to come together and find a way forward that honours the rights and freedoms of children to protection from adults, while honouring the important principle of artistic freedom of expression. I believe, all willing, that there is a way to achieve this. We do not believe that any adult should be free to usurp child protection responsibilities for their own personal satisfaction, be it artistic, monetary, sexual, or any other reason. This comes at the expense of the rights and freedoms of children and plays directly into the hands of those who want to liberate children and young people from the laws and protocols which protect them. Serious questions need to be asked. Who decides what is pornography and what is art? Who decides if these can't be one and the same? Who decides who is an artist, and therefore who can freely take photos of naked children and then disseminate them? When are these decisions made? What are the checks and balances, the risk management within the arts community that would protect children from sexual exploitation? We have learnt that they're not in the law. Definitions of terms under the law such as intent, sexual context, child pornography, artistic, public benefit, purpose, dissemination, possession have all been exposed as vagaries that are difficult, if not impossible, to predictably embody in the law, let alone prosecute under the law. It's all based on opinion, basically. So what's the way forward? How does the arts community face its obligations to child protection and still maintain their freedoms and their rights? I believe the first step comes with the arts community accepting that it has a responsibility and a role to play in the protection of children from sexually exploitative actions by persons or processes from within their own ranks. The next step is to find that way forward. Rigorous testing of the current system is critical so as to highlight why it failed, where it failed, how best to embody protections that protect everybody's interests. I've put this to the New South Wales Attorney General's Office and asked that these issues be exhaustively examined. I am assured that they will be, and that the Attorney General has directed that this happen under the New South Wales Sentencing Council, headed by Justice James Wood. This report, as I understand it, is now to be handed down in September instead of June as a result of this inclusion in that brief. 2, I would put it to the arts community that there is an urgent need to establish protocols around artists working with children under the age of consent. That a process be implemented that looks at the issues before the work is commenced rather than after. This could take the form of an official authorised peer review team, including advocates and lawyers, to determine the bona fides of any person who intends to work with naked children, who calls themselves an artist or says they're an artist, and the examination of the artistic merit, the intent, and the undertaking of a public benefit versus public detriment test as to the effect this work may have on other sectors of the wider community and particularly on child protection. It is my belief that a process must be established that would eliminate the existing potential for anyone to exploit artistic freedoms of expression and artistic rights in order to achieve their own more sinister aspirations. It is expected that closing these loopholes in the law without unduly impinging on artistic freedoms would win wide support. And I mention here that even Mr Henson himself conceded that much of his support from the arts community was not so much about, well, some of it was, but much of it wasn't about the artistic merit of his work or the merit of the work. It was about the principles of art, which we all respect. What is not acceptable moving forward is that this situation be allowed to go past unrectified. The potential for the arts community to come into disrepute is real. The tolerance of or failure to address this real threat, either by action or inaction, would be to ignore each of our responsibilities to the protection of the human rights of children. When both sides of the fence can see merit in each other's arguments and then find a way through that protects the rights and freedoms of children, as well as protecting artistic freedoms, we will have progress. Thank you.
Julian Burnside.
I suppose as the token lawyer I should start with defining what it is we're talking about. Censorship, it seems to me, can be taken globally as meaning any method by which members of the public are prevented from seeing a work of art or reading a work of art, as the case may be. So it doesn't matter whether it's done by the Office of Film and Literature Censorship or whether it's done by bringing public pressure to bear on a gallery or an individual artist, or whether it's done by threatening or actually bringing charges of pornography or related charges. Each of these methods is calculated to prevent work from being seen and is therefore properly thought of as censorship. The debate about the Henson exhibition has really run on two parallel tracks. On one track has been the notion we must protect children from exploitation, and no one could argue against that. On the other track, artistic freedom is important, and not many people have argued against that, although some might wonder whether a case that supports the notion of privileging the arts has ever actually been articulated. I want to deal with those two parts. The question of protection. Well, who is being protected and from what are they being protected? And I'm now addressing the range of censorship generally. The who is being protected is either the public at large or perhaps an individual within the public, and that's probably been the real case in the recent debate. The concern has been for the individual children who were the subject of some of the photographs. The interesting thing about it is that, everything that Hetty has said is in a sense, or at least most of what she said, is in a sense unarguably right. You can't dispute the motherhood statements that she makes. The real problem is drawing any connection at all between the motherhood statements on the one hand and the Bill Henson exhibition on the other hand. What is the connection between them? She has not put forward a single fact to suggest that the children who were photographed suffered any harm at all. Furthermore, she fails entirely to put forward a view that the children didn't consent, and if she wants to raise the question, well, could they validly consent? The fact is their parents consented as well, and as a matter of law, the age at which a person can consent to various things moves progressively from their birth through to their attaining their majority, according to their development, their intelligence, and the nature of the thing to which they're asked to consent. So, an infant can't consent to an injection. An injection without consent would be an assault, but the parents can properly consent on the child's behalf to the infant getting an injection. When the child is 8 or 10 years old, the child might be able to give or withhold consent to an injection. And likewise for more sophisticated medical procedures, progressively as they approach their majority, children gain the capacity, the legal capacity, to consent to more and more things until, as adults, they can consent to or withhold consent for anything that might otherwise violate their rights. There is no suggestion whatever that the children who were photographed by Bill Henson suffered any harm at all. But for this, by making the issue so public, by making the core of the argument for protection the proposition that there is something repulsive, offensive, or indecent about the naked adolescent body, that may harm children. Because we all know one of the deep truths which Bill's work shows is it reminds us of the terrors of adolescence. The transition from childhood to adulthood is a terrifying time during which our bodies rebel and betray us, during which childhood certainties are all overturned, and during those few years of transition, we really do not know who we are or where we're going. Our bodies in particular are a source of embarrassment when we are adolescent, at least all but the luckiest. And I cannot think of anything more damaging than to have it said publicly that your body, neutrally naked, is itself a thing that gives offence to the public. If there's been any harm caused in this last 3 weeks, it has been caused by those who make the argument that Hetty Johnson has run. So what are we being protected from? Well, generally speaking, if you look at the history of censorship, there are two forms of harm from which we're being protected. First, ideological harm, and second, moral harm. In the realm of ideological harm, you will find it, generally speaking, political or blasphemy is the subject matter. Political censorship is not so popular these days. It was flourishing in Australia in the 1920s. It popped up its head again in 1998 when Rabelais wanted to publish an article called A Guide to Shoplifting, which no doubt was going to be a very useful addition to the La Trobe University students' education. It was banned by the censors on the grounds that it was encouraging criminal activity, and in fact, on any neutral reading of it, if you read it in the law reports, that's exactly what it did. I think that's about as close as we've come to real political censorship in recent times. Blasphemy is a different matter. Blasphemy has an interesting history, which we don't have time to go into, but blasphemy emerged as an offence in England during the reign of Henry VIII. Why? Because Henry VIII had declared himself the head of the breakaway Church of England. And there are cases in the 16th century which say that an attack on the church is an attack on the state. And so it was, in a sense, a branch of political censorship. The most recent attempt in Australia to use the law of blasphemy against a work of art was the Piss Christ case, in which I had the pleasure of acting on behalf of the National Gallery of Victoria. Then Archbishop George Pell decided that what was outwardly a very lyrical, not terribly interesting photograph of a crucifix surrounded by golden liquid was backlit and soft focus, was blasphemous. He could not have maintained the argument unless he knew the title, which was Piss Christ. The attempt to prevent the exhibition from being shown failed, but sadly, as Ian pointed out, the exhibition was cancelled voluntarily by Timothy Potts, who I hereafter thought of as Piss Potts. The other branch of harm, and this is really where you get all the interest in censorship, is protecting us from moral harm. Few people remember that Chloe, that iconic painting that hangs in Young and Jackson's, was removed from public viewing in 1880. That in the 1960s, radio commentator Ernie Sigley was banished from Melbourne radio stations because he used the word pregnant on the air. That in 1973, the presenters of a play called The Boys and the Band were prosecuted for obscenity because one of the lines in the play was, "Who do you have to fuck to get a drink around here?" It's surprising to see how the landscape has changed since then. In 1975 and again in 1998, for good measure, the film Salo was banned. And in my research of the Serrano case, I came across a fascinating case which tests something about our values. You know, censorship and issues of censorship like this always come about at the places where the tectonic plates of our values collide. And you test where the moral values of the society are by the way the decisions go. I hope we're not heading back towards a bonfire of the vanities, but I fear sometimes. In 1978 in England, a jeweller and a gallery were prosecuted for displaying an obscene article, namely a pair of pendant earrings. The pendants, it was said, were freeze-dried human fetuses, which really does raise a yuck factor immediately. And I think I'm fairly tolerant. But I've tested a number of people on this proposition. Let it be supposed that you think the yuck factor is enough to justify canning that work, what if you discovered 6 months later that in truth they were not freeze-dried human fetuses, they were just the artist's detailed replication of what he imagined freeze-dried human fetuses looked like? Does that change the quality of the work in some way? Does it make it any the less offensive? Is it just the idea that makes it offensive? Because if your assessment of the thing changes when you know that it's not in truth freeze-dried human fetuses, then what is being censored is an idea that we do not like. And it seems to me that if you look at the way censorship operates, it is preeminently the battleground of ideas. And can me if you want, but I'm in the camp of those who say that ideas can do very little harm and shouldn't be in chains. Look at what the battleground of ideas has thrown up for our consideration. Kate Kollwitz in the 1930s, powerful, disturbing drawings, charcoal drawings of people starving to death in the Weimar Republic. The famous photograph by Robert Capa of a man in the Spanish Civil War in 1936 at the very moment of his death, as he falls backward with his rifle falling behind him and his head exploding. The photographs of the concentration camps of Europe, how obscene were those photographs? Piles of naked, emaciated bodies in the most wretched, undignified position imaginable. And yet no one would think of censoring those. And remember, one of the most famous photographs from the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese girl, 10 or 11 years old by appearance, running naked from a burning village, plainly terrified, clearly not a subject who consented to the photograph or the circumstances in which she was photographed. No one suggested censoring that. Why? What have all these things got in common? It's this: they all tell us truths of which we need to know. They reveal to us facts which help us in society's gradual movement towards understanding. They are essential photographs, they're essential images for us to see and to know about. How does this relate to Bill Henson? Well, as I've said, adolescence is a time of real terror. It's a time which causes great pain to most people who go through it until they escape into the blissful amnesia of adulthood. And what is distressing about Bill's images is that they remind us of a truth we would rather forget. And that's the reason we should be allowed to see them. I want to finish by just reminding you, I've said in passing, that if Hetty had her way, then where we will end up is something like the Bonfire of the Vanities. Because if you look at the works of Titian, of Caravaggio, of Botticelli, they would all fail her test. Not to mention the television advertisements for disposable nappies. They fail the test as well. I mean, those children aren't consenting, and how are they going to feel about it in 20 years' time, she would have to ask. Makeup on sale for children who are prepubescent. This is the way we sexualise our children, by selling them things that grown-ups are accustomed to wear. And beauty shows for children. What about the idea that children dress up like little adults and show themselves off? Little Miss Sunshine was a great example of that, quite an entertaining film which poked fun at the idea of child beauty contests. If you want to point to any obscenities, point to those, not to Bill Henson's work. I'm afraid to say that if we allow ourselves to be seduced by Hetty's motherhood ideas, we will end up again with the Bonfire of the Vanities, turning our faces towards the past. Thank you.